Copper Sun by Sharon Draper. Chapter 2, Strangers and Death. The strangers whom Besa had spoken of arrived about an hour later. Everyone in the village came out of their houses to see the astonishing sight. Pale, unhealthy-looking men who carried large bundles and unusual-looking sticks as they marched into the center of the village. In spite of the welcoming greetings and looks of excitement on the faces of the villagers, the strangers did not smile. They smelled of danger. Amari thought as one of them looked at her. He had eyes the color of the sky. She shuddered. However, the unusual-looking men were accompanied by warriors from the Ashanti tribe, men of her own land, men her people had known and traded with. So even if the village elders were concerned, it would be unacceptable not to show hospitality. Surely the Ashanti would explain. But good manners came first. Any occasion for visitors was a cause for excitement, so after the initial amazement and curiosity at the strange men, the village bubbled with anticipation as preparations were made for a formal welcoming ceremony. Amari stayed in the shadows, watching it all, uneasy, but not sure why. Their chief, or Awamafia, who could be spoken to only through a member of the Council of Elders, invited the guests to sit, and they were formally welcomed with wine and prayers. The chief and the Council of Elders, made up of both men and women, were always chosen for their wisdom and made all the important decisions. Amari was proud that her father, Kamla, was one of the elders. He was also the village storyteller, and she loved to watch the expressions on his face as he acted out the stories she had heard since childhood. "We welcome you," the chief began. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. May you be protected from evil, and may you live to a ripe old age. If you come in peace, we receive you in peace. Heroism is the dignity of our ancestors, and in their name, we welcome you. He passed the wine, made from palm tree leaves, to Amari's father, then to the other elders, and finally to the strangers. The men with skin like the milk of goats and their Ashanti companions drank the palm wine from hand-carved gourds that had been decorated with ceremonial tribal designs. The newcomers then offered gifts to the chief, small ropes of sparkling beads, unlike anything Amari had ever seen, casks of wine, and lengths of fine cloth, so shiny and smooth that Amari marveled. No human could have woven it. No real explanations for their presence had been given yet, but with the exchange of gifts, the feeling of unease began to lessen, and everyone knew that the dancing and drumming would soon begin. Ceremony was important. Business matters always followed proper celebration. It was not yet the time for questions. First came the stories, Amari reminded herself, starting to feel excited. As chief storyteller, Amari's father was highly respected. Kamla knew every story, every proverb, every bit of tribal history ever told or sung or drummed by her people. He spoke at each birth, funeral, and wedding, as well as at unexpected special occasions like this. The villagers crowded around him in anticipation, although even the youngest child knew by heart every story he would tell. The strangers sat politely and waited. "Let me tell you the wickedness of the chief Agokali," his father began. "He was a wicked, wicked man." "Wicked," the people responded with enthusiasm. "He would give the Yui people impossible jobs, like weaving baskets out of sand." "Impossible," the people responded almost in unison. "The Yui people finally found a means to escape from the wicked ruler," Kamla recounted. "The people crept out through a hole in the wall and fooled the soldiers of Chief Agokali." "And how did they do that?" he asked the crowd, who, of course, knew the question was coming as well as the answer. "They walked backward in the dirt," the people responded enthusiastically. "And so they did," Kamla said, ending his tale with a tapping on his drum. "They walked backward on the dirt path, so their footprints looked like the prints of someone arriving into the village, not departing." He looked over at Amari as he finished the tale with a wink he saved for her alone. Everyone in the small village, including Amari, laughed and clapped their hands at the familiar story. Amari loved her father's stories, and the sound of his deep, gravelly voice had always made her feel safe, whether he was whispering silly noises in her ear, speaking formally in a meeting of the elders, or chatting with affection with his mother. To the family's great amusement, Kamla would sometimes sing to them in their small hut after the evening meal. "You sound like a monkey in pain," Amari's mother would tell her husband fondly, but when he was telling stories, his voice was magical. Amari could listen to him all night. The feeling of tension faded. The drumming would come next, and after the storytelling, this was Amari's favorite part of the village's celebrations. Amari looked around for Besa. He was the assistant to the village master artsman, the one responsible for the creation of all the dances and drum rhythms. She knew Besa would be anxious to show off his skill on the drum that he had carved and painted himself. Amari was proud of how devoted Besa was to learning the rhythms. He'd once told her, "You know, Amari, the drums are not just noise. They are language. They are the pattern of the rhythm of our lives." He had no need to look at his hands to produce the drum sounds that lived within him. She loved to watch Besa stare into space, smiling as he drummed, lost in the rhythms he created. As soon as the master drummers started playing, everyone in the village felt the call. The younger boys whose fingers itched to show their skills grabbed their own small drums and joined the beat. Villagers began to get up and move to the rhythms. Besa played with the confidence and skill he always did. As Amari's eyes were on him only, her heart beat faster as Besa's fingers caressed the sounds out of her skin-covered drum. Drum beats echoed in the approaching darkness. The fire in the center of the assembly area glowed in the faces of the dancers, mostly young children and women at first. But soon, nearly everyone in the village joined in, even the old ones, whose toothless grins spoke their happiness. All spoke to the spirits with their joyous movements. Their bodies swayed, their hands clapped, their feet stomped in a glorious frenzy, all to the rhythm of the drums. Ba ba la ba do ka we do. The words are sounds, are words from deep within, from a place that was lost, now found. So bo he we do ma so. Sound is self, is you is we, sound is past is now so. So bo he we do maho dahu so. From remembered past to forgotten tomorrow, from drum talk throbs, breathes life, sings words. Ba la ba ba, ga we do. Warriors pulse, maidens sway, elders, children rejoice. Thrum to the heartbeat, Ba ba la ba 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 la ba ba we do. Kwasi, as round and brown as a cola nut, danced with the rest of the children, gleefully spinning in the dust. Amari watched him and remembered how he once had captured a small bird and copied its movements, flapping his arms like wings, telling her with much laughter that he intended to learn to fly. And as Kwasi stomped and glided through the dust that evening, it seemed to Amari that he really was flying. He ran over to Amari, then breathing hard with excitement. "Come," he said, grasping her arm and trying to pull her into the dancing. "Why do you hide in the shadows? Come dance for the strangers." She pushed Kwasi away gently, reminding him she was no longer a child. She was to be married soon, and she preferred peeking at Besa, who stood behind his waist-high drum on the other side of the fire, watching her as well. The drum beats rippled in the darkness, the dancers swayed and stomped on the hard-packed earth, and Amari's people clapped and laughed at the firelight as the firelight glimmered in the night. The first explosion came from the other end of the unusual weapon sticks the strangers carried. Louder than any beat of even the loudest drum, it was followed by a cry of horror. The chief had fallen off his seat, a huge red bleeding hole in the center of his chest. More explosions followed in rapid succession. Then everyone was screaming. Confusion and dust swirled throughout the village. Amari watched, aghast, as a mother with her baby wrapped on her back tried to flee, but both mother and child were clubbed down into the dirt by one of the Ashanti warriors. An Ashanti? How could this be? Villagers ran blindly into the fire, trying to escape and screaming for mercy, only to be felled by the terrible fire weapons of the strangely pale men. Amari knew she should run. She knew she should try to escape into the forest, but her feet would not move. She could only stare in horror. She gasped as she watched an Ashanti grab her mother and try to put thick iron cuffs on her mother's wrists. She turned her head and followed, in slow motion it seemed, her father's bellows of rage as he leaped toward her mother to rescue her. But before he even reached her, one of the milk-faced men thrust a knife into his stomach, and Kamala fell silently to the earth. Amari's mother screamed in anguish and bit her captor's hand. Enraged, he hurled her to the ground. Amari watched, unable to move or breathe, as her mother's head smashed upon a rock. Amari wanted to scream, "Mother, get up! Oh, please, get up!" But she was unable to say a word. Her mother did not move. Amari needed her parents to come get her, to tell her not to be afraid, to run with her into the underbrush for safety. But they just lay there, their blood beginning to stain the dust. Amari doubled over in agony. Her parents were dead. She looked frantically for Besa and Quasi, but all was smoke and screams and death. Finally, she saw Quasi running toward her, screaming, "Run, Amari, run!" Her feet loosened, then he reached her. She grabbed his hand, and they ran wildly out of the village into what they hoped was the safety of the darkness. Sharp branches cut Amari's face as she plunged through a thick tangle of trees. The smell of sharp, acrid smoke, not of gentle hearth fires, but of the flames of destruction, followed them. Birds and monkeys above them cried out in alarm, but their noise could not cover the screams of the slaughter of her people. Suddenly, Amari heard fast-moving, thudding footsteps behind her and the whir of a spear. Quasi held her hand tighter, and they ran even faster. Amari trying in vain to be as invisible and swift as the wind. "Fly, my brother," she thought desperately. "Fly away." One moment they were leaping over a fallen log, and the next moment she heard Quasi moan softly. Then his hand slipped slowly from hers. He slumped to the ground, a look of soft surprise on his small face. A spear had sliced through his whole little body. Amari sank down beside him and held him to her. He died in her arms. She lay there in the darkness, cuddling his small, lifeless body, unable to weep, unable to run any longer. She hardly cared when she was grabbed by one of the strangers. Her arms were wrenched behind her, and iron shackles with heavy, rusty chains between them were snapped onto her wrists, holding them there. Amari was marched back to where the burning village had once stood so happily, grabbed by her hair and shoved into a pile of other survivors from the village. No one spoke. No one wept. They were defeated.